Great. And with that, I'm going to spotlight Lisa. There we go. Thank you, Reverend Lisa.
Thank you, Pablo. Good evening, everyone. My name is Reverend Lisa Garcia-Sampson. I proudly serve as the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry of North Carolina, coming to you from Durham, North Carolina, residing on Lumbee and Shakori Indigenous lands. My pronouns are she, her. Really grateful to be in this space tonight. I hope that you can feel the abundance of our faith tonight as we have lots of people flooding into the room still. We're looking at the chat, seeing all the people who are here. I hope you can feel the spirit of movement within us and among us tonight. And I hope that you feel the power that we have and the call of our faith to believe, not in the intervention of a higher power, but to believe in us and in the power of our movement to do the work that we will be doing and learning about tonight. So I invite you to take a moment with me to center as we enter into this time of learning and reflection about the Electoral Count Act and the work ahead of us. Of course, we are grounded in our UU principles, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process, respect and reverence for the interconnected web of all beings, and our responsibility to be fair and just in our relationships. Our faith tells us that when inequity and injustice exists among parts of the whole, there's a sense in which we are not whole. And when we witness this within our democracy, the spirit of our nation aches, and we feel that deep aching too. Pablo was just asking about reactions to these January 6 hearings. I've heard so many people describe that in watching these hearings that their hearts and their stomachs physically hurt. And this is a manifestation of our rage and our grief and our yearning, and we ache because we believe in the great aspiration of our country to realize a truly just and inclusive democracy. And so we light this chalice and we prepare ourselves to hear what will be shared tonight, the hard truth about the attempt to deny the voices of the American people, the precious opportunity before us to protect and to strengthen our electoral systems, and the moral imperative that we not let this opportunity pass us by. This is the work of our faith. May we know the urgency, the possibility of this moment. May we hear this movement for a just democracy calling our name, and may we answer the call. Amen. And now I will pass it over to my fellow North Carolinian and a member of the UUSJ Democracy Action Team, Donna Scheidt, to help frame what is at stake for us tonight.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
I'm joining you tonight from just outside of Greensboro, North Carolina, member of Unitarian Universalist Church of Greensboro. The Electoral Count Act is one of the most important laws that you may have never heard of regarding the presidential elections here in the United States. And as we'll hear from Cerin in just a little bit, it's clunky, it's antiquated, it was patched together in the late 19th century. And it needs a serious refresh if we're to avoid another January 6th. So glad you've joined us tonight, and I'm really thrilled to have Protect Democracy's Cerin with us, who will be handing this over to in just a little bit. But before we get there, I just want to say a word or two to frame this issue from a Unitarian Universalist perspective. If you've been reading the news, if you've been watching the January 6th hearings, as I know many of us have been, you know that January 6th was not just a physical assault on our nation's capital. It was an attempted coup. It was orchestrated legally and politically. And the current ECA, the Electoral Count Act, provided a roadmap a roadmap full of patchy potholes, constitutional, statutory loopholes that inspired those who would exploit it. The threat was very real, as we've come to find out. And to put it bluntly, what was at stake was the popular will, the votes of, as I figure it, over 25 million voters in several swing states, including Arizona, Georgia, New Mexico, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Our UU faith, especially our fifth principle, compels us, as Reverend Lisa just said, to act with respect to issues of democracy. And what you hear tonight might seem a little bit technical. Feel free to weigh in, to ask questions. We have a great expert with us, and so delighted to hear from her. But let's keep in mind the big picture here, which is that reforming the ECA is one step that we can take to preventing rising authoritarianism in the United States. Reforming the ECA is also about voting rights. It's about protecting the popular will and the votes of tens of millions of voters across this country. And reforming the ECA is about election protection. Locally, of course, as many of us here in North Carolina are aware, we need to be sensitive to the real threats to election workers and the new laws on the books that make their lives more difficult than ever in many states. And unfortunately, we need to be aware, as we heard today during the hearings, of the possibility of further violence at our polls. But the threat of constitutional crisis that could upend our elections is also real, and reforming the ECA can help us curb this threat. And as Pablo likes to say, to close the door, we hope, on another coup attempt. So I'm excited again to learn more this evening. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Cerin.
I just want to take a moment to introduce Cerin for the event. Cerin joins us from Protect Democracy, as I said in our soft welcome, one of the organizations leading the conversation on why the ECA needs to be updated. Cerin works towards reforms, preventing the abuse of executive power, and restoring Congress as an effective check and balance on executive authority. And I was really interested to hear that she previously served as a trial attorney at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, secretly one of my favorite divisions within the DOJ. I think they do some of the most important work at the Department of Justice that I've seen happen. And she was previously a senior legislative assistant for Senator Barbara Boxer. So we know that she understands Capitol Hill and how decision makers posture themselves with regard to important issues and tough votes. So with that, I'm going to invite Cerin to join us and allow us to spotlight her, and then tell us what we should know about the state of play on the ECA and the background.
Thank you so much to you, Pablo, and Reverend Lisa, so much for centering us in this space. I will try to start just with some introductions and sort of soften you up, and before I get to the super nerdy parts about the Electoral Count Act of 1887 itself. You guys should feel free to tap out and put questions in the chat at any time. As a lawyer who sometimes dons my lawyer hat a little too hard, I absolutely, please welcome questions, because there are no stupid questions. I would much rather you ask it now and be ready to give that answer to a future senator or Senate staffer or member that you're meeting with later. So please bring the questions on. I will just say about Protect Democracy in general, we are an organization that is nonpartisan, nonprofit, and is dedicated to trying to prevent the decline of our government into more authoritarian forms of government. And we began work on the Electoral Count Act actually in the run-up to the 2020 election, as we were working to identify potential threats to the administration of the election and the peaceful transition of power after the election. So I sometimes we say that we were interested in the Electoral Count Act before it was cool. I also just want to note that faith coalitions played a hugely important role in protecting the 2020 election. And I think you'll be crucial in preparing for 2024, every step along the way to protecting free and fair elections and peaceful transitions of power going forward. So we really look forward to being a resource to all of you, as well as the broader network of faith organizations that you work with who are doing such vital work to protect our democracy. That said, reforming the Electoral Count Act is one of our most urgent priorities this year. And it really is this year. I think sometimes people think, oh, well, the presidential election is in 2024. That seems so far away from now. This year is the best opportunity to fix it, and not just fix it around the edges, not just edits here and there, but really shore it up so it can last the next century. We feel very strongly that the minute presidential campaigns start to get underway at the end of this year, as potentially Congress may change hands following the election, we lose our best opportunity. So every week that goes by is the week that I wish we had an Electoral Count Act bill that could come to the floor of the Senate or the House and get a vote. And I'm about to dive into the details, but before I do, I just want to also emphasize how much extraordinary agreement there is across a spectrum of different people who come from different places when it comes to many of these issues and the laws and their politics, and how much there is agreement amongst the people who have dug into the details of the Electoral Count Act and what we need to do to actually bring about substantive reforms. So just as an example, when the House Administration Committee, which is the committee on the House side, the House of Representatives that has jurisdiction over the Electoral Count Act and election laws in general, they put out a report late last year, basically outlining what they thought should be done to reform the Electoral Count Act. And one of the groups that praised the report and said that they were largely on board with much of the substance of the report was the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian organization that is really a very different political actor, you can imagine, from the folks who are staffing Chairwoman Zoe Lofgren's office in the House Administration Committee on the Democratic side. And that's just an illustrative example of the kinds of folks who have come together to find agreement when it comes to what needs to be done to reform the Electoral Count Act. That said, I'm going to jump into at least the 5 things that Protect Democracy has been really emphasizing as like what we need to see, what we think we should see to make sure that reform of the Electoral Count Act doesn't just patch here and there, but really prepares us for lasting another century. There's a few things that are sort of low-hanging fruit. One is making clear that the role of the vice president is ceremonial. I think there's been a lot of testimony that you guys have probably seen before the committee recently about how there's probably nothing less democratic than the idea that a single person could pick the president of the United States. Strongly agree. I think about the joint session of Congress under the Electoral Count Act a lot like the Oscars. The host and the celebrity presenter are there to open the envelopes, and then they read out the name that's in the envelope. They're not there to pick which name is in the envelope. They are not there to order off a menu of who they think best actress or actor or picture should be. They're there to read out the results of the Democratic selection to the audience. And that is a lot like what we want the role of the vice president to be clarified as. We need it to be clarified as that is a ceremonial role. It is outlined in the Constitution, so it is serious, and the VP needs to actually perform the role, but it is a performance. It is not an opportunity to overturn the results of the election, and it is not an opportunity to pick the winner of the election. So that's something that is broadly agreed that should be clarified. Another sort of like slightly easier thing to tackle is raising the threshold for objections, making it harder to object. Right now, it takes only one member of the House and one member of the Senate. That's not a very high bar, finding 2 people to agree to do something that's maybe not very wise and possibly undemocratic. And so some proposals would move it to a 5th or a quarter or a 1/3 of the House and a 1/3 of the Senate. The point is there's broad agreement on making it a higher threshold. There's, I think, more or less agreement on sort of what exactly that higher threshold should be. a fifth or a quarter are well within the proposals that we've seen, that we've put forward with partners. And I think that the bottom line is it should be at least harder than 2 people to move forward an objection, to make sure that it's substantive and that there's some pressure on members to actually get support for their position and interrogate the merits of their position in order to put it forward. Admittedly, a few other things beyond those first 2 are a little bit trickier. One in particular is there's a provision in the Electoral Count Act that is, and this is true of the whole law, inartfully written at best. And it's become a focus of a bunch of state legislatures, and this has come up in the hearings as well, who were looking for an excuse to go on a constitutional misadventure, shall we say. And the provision basically says that if a state fails to make a choice, it provides for a state legislature to potentially, in some exceptions, provide for situations. That was intended to deal with runoffs. That was a section inartfully crafted at a time when runoff elections were possible. And we need an ECA reform to clarify when electors can be appointed after Election Day and when they can't. So, for example, clarifying that this section is not an invitation to state legislatures to simply make a choice of whoever they think should be selected by their state, but in fact, binding state legislatures very clearly that states run their elections. States are empowered to set the terms within constitutional limits for those elections. But once Congress has set the time for choosing of electors under its powers under Article 2, that's it. States have to choose by that time. And once that time is passed, state legislatures don't have a get out of Constitution free card that allows them to sort of choose again just because they don't like how the election went. And so that's a really important thing to clarify. And I just want to emphasize, while some states have read this provision to invite this kind of misunderstanding, we feel very strongly that that is a misunderstanding under the law, that it was incredibly clear that this was provided not to allow for this kind of chicanery, but for certain runoff elections that were possible under the laws at the time. And we think it's inappropriate entirely that people have used the ambiguity and the sort of poor drafting in this section to invite that kind of confusion. Another thing that is important to tackle but difficult to tackle is making sure that state determinations of their election results are clear. So making sure that the state is held accountable for following state and federal laws and administering the election, and for sending that certification to the archivist and to Congress. So we've been advocating for some form of judicial review to make sure that if somehow an actor in the state goes rogue and perhaps deviates from what the state law directs, there is some way to hold that state official accountable. Obviously, there are folks on the conservative end of the spectrum, and even folks on the left who are very much advocates of states' rights, and quite correctly view states as being in the driver's seat of administering their own elections. That said, the duty to certify the election, send the certificate to the archivist, to actually report that result to the joint session of Congress, it's a federal duty. It's outlined in our Constitution. It's something we need the state to do to make our federal process work for a presidential election. And we feel strongly that having some method of accountability to make sure that states do that and that it's clear is really important. One of the reasons is the last thing that we feel strongly about, which is making sure that clear state determinations actually bind Congress. If you've gone to the trouble of making sure that states have followed the law, followed state law, followed federal law, given a clear answer to Congress, it's important that Congress can't just toss out the answer because they don't like it. Just like the state can't toss, the state legislature or the state governor can't toss out an answer because they don't like it, Congress shouldn't be able to either. And making clear that we narrow the grounds for objections, and that the grounds for objections don't include, I don't like the way that this election came out in the state, is an incredibly important piece. There's some, again, ambiguous and artful drafting in the law right now. The term that I think I like the least in section 15 is called regularly given. And it had a certain meaning at the time where it meant that it was like obeying the constitutional rules that they had laid out for actually providing electoral votes. But it's not doing the work it needs to now. It's certainly not providing clarity to members of Congress who are being asked to participate in this joint session and to do their constitutional duty, and making it clear that just as other people who participate in this very important process are not invited to just make a choice, that this provision also does not just allow members of Congress to make a choice is an incredibly important piece of this puzzle. So those are sort of like the 5 pieces of the puzzle that we see as being substantively important. To maybe take a step back and sort of tell you more about where everything is right now, there are sort of, depending on how you count, 2 different efforts, or 2 different but related efforts in the House and 2 different but related efforts in the Senate tackling Electoral Count Act reform. In the House Administration Committee staff has really dug in. As I said, they were provided a whole report last year outlining a lot of the things that they would do to reform the Electoral Count Act. The January 6th committee as well has said that this is something that they may consider, and it certainly has come up as part of their hearings. And there's members who serve on both those committees who crossed over, including the Chairwoman Lofgren. On the Senate side, Senators Klobuchar, Durbin, and King have put out a discussion draft, not a bill, but a discussion draft towards the beginning of this year. Senator Klobuchar is also the chairwoman of the Rules Committee, the Senate Rules Committee, that has jurisdiction over this law on the Senate side. And there is an ad hoc working group, the Senate working group, led by Senators Collins and Manchin, joined by senators who, if I've read the chat correctly, represent actually many of the states from which you are from, who have been trying to work through a bipartisan, we hope, ECA reform proposal, and have reported that they are trying to do so any week or day now. I just want to say that we have a lot of gratitude to these senators and members of the House working on this. This isn't an infrastructure bill. Like, nobody's going to create jobs with the Electoral Count Act. Nobody's going to build a bridge or a road by fixing democracy, except in that our democracy is essential to the building of all the things that we live with, love, and take for granted. But it's not the kind of bill that often is easy to prioritize. And so to the extent that you can, for members that you're talking with who have been devoting resources and devoting time to engaging in this process, hope you will consider thanking them for their attention to this incredibly important issue. It is not an easy one to tackle, and a lot of people have been learning a lot about some very old dusty slices of Title III of the US Code. And I think it's really important that for the folks who have been engaging it, they hear that it's important to their constituents that they have been, because that's really, really helpful to all the advocates who keep pushing them, for them to have that message reinforced from their constituents. I care about this. Democracy matters to me. Fixing this bill matters to our ability to keep our government democratic. That is an incredibly important message. And pairing that with sort of gratitude and support that they hear and see that their actual constituents care about this thing that they're doing is incredibly impactful. I will just also say that, to the extent that you are talking with or writing members, or if you run into them in the grocery store, which I think is probably one of the most effective forms of advocacy I've ever seen, asking members to support reform that tackles the important issues we just walked through. We don't need a perfect bill, but if it's going to last the next century, we need a good one. And it's really important for people not to stop at the first 2 issues, to actually engage with the whole list. If they can, to the extent they can, we really do need them to engage with the whole list. It would be a real shame if we weren't able to get a bill out of this process that did more than sort of tackle the low-hanging fruit of this. And also asking for members to support bringing this to the floor for a vote this year. There's not a lot of time left in terms of floor time. It's an election year. They have a couple weeks in July, a couple weeks in September, and then nothing in terms of floor time until after the election, and then a couple weeks in November and December. And that seems like a lot of time, but anytime you bring something to the floor of the Senate, you burn a week basically just getting cloture on the process, making sure that you have 60 votes, burning the time in the filibuster, considering any amendments. Like it takes a week just to actually change, like make up your mind about something, even if you go into the week thinking that you have an agreement. So that's not actually that much time, since they also have to fund the government and a couple other really hot button issues, national defense authorization. There's enough other things on Congress's plate and little enough time to do them that it's going to need to have some support from constituents like you, from groups like yours, asking people to make this a priority to get done this year. The focus has been on members in the Senate Working Group and urging them to continue their work and pushing it forward. But if and as the Senate Working Group, if we hope, comes out with a proposal, maybe sometime this week or next, the focus will shift to asking senators outside the working group to support it, and asking folks in the House who've been engaged to take a look and see if they, what they think of the Senate proposal, and if there's common ground that we can hopefully find. We've found a lot of common ground off the Hill, and I think we're hoping that that translates to some common ground on the Hill, but that's going to take work in bringing people together. And that is, I think, all I have to say, but I'm very, very happy to answer any questions that folks have. I see a few in the chat. I don't know if, Pablo, if you wanted to pick out questions, or I'm happy to, however you like.
I believe David Shilton of our Democracy Action Team is going to handle it, because I've got the voice issue.
Sure. Yeah. I will do that. First, I have to make a shout out here to a fellow former trial attorney at the Department of Justice. I see I was in a different division, but appreciate your work in the antitrust division. I'll summarize a few of the good questions we've been getting, but first I'll use the prerogative to ask my own question. This has been really helpful, by the way, for what we'll be doing in this next week or so, talking to these offices to get this background from you, and do appreciate that. One issue that's come up, you mentioned that there seems to be general agreement that it should be harder to raise objections to the electoral slates that are sent by states. Right now, just one member of each house. What about some groups have said, well, we should also make it harder for both chambers of Congress to approve an objection. Right now, it's a majority. There should be a supermajority requirement. Others have said, no, that's not a good idea. What if a state or an executive of state sends a phony slate of electors, and we've seen that attempt, of course, in 2020. Would you really want to make a supermajority requirement? Do you have any views on whether there should be any change to the current majority vote rule?
We fall down amongst the folks who are concerned that a supermajority requirement would not be a good idea. And just let's just outline the process. So the idea is that somebody would raise an objection under a reformed DCA. It would be not just one person from the House or Senate. It would be maybe, let's say, a fifth of the House and a fifth of the Senate. So you get all those folks signed on the dotted line, you raise an objection, and then what happens is the joint session divides. Now, just think about that for a minute. 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate. You got to divide, because if you didn't, the House would just express its opinion and win every time. So you divide so that you get an answer from the House as the House, and you get an answer from the Senate as the Senate. And the tricky thing about that is the House and Senate have some ability to set their own rules. The House is not a continuing body. Every Congress, every 2 years, you get a whole new House. So this year, we are in the second year of the 117th Congress and the 117th version of the House of Representatives. Next year, we will be on the 118th. The Senate is a continuing body, but they still have some abilities to change their rules at a majority threshold. That is admittedly called the nuclear option. under the written rules of the Senate, you're supposed to need considerably more than that to actually change the Senate rules. But there is still this lingering possibility of rules changes at a majority threshold. And so the reason I bring that up is if you have a supermajority requirement in the statute in the Electoral Count Act, and the House and Senate divide, and they decide, either the House or the Senate, to exercise their abilities, just as bodies, to change their rules, ignore the supermajority requirement in statute, and come back to the joint session with an answer at a majority threshold, it leaves a lot of lack of clarity, a lot of confusion about what happens next. You've gotten an answer from the House, but it wasn't an answer that met the terms of the statute. You've got an answer from the Senate, hopefully nobody trying to filibuster and change rules that way, but you haven't actually met the terms of the statute. And we think that's a real danger to the clarity of how the joint session operates, and exactly the kind of ambiguity that we're hoping reform avoids and prevents.
Gotcha. That's very helpful. We will keep that in mind and focus on some of the other ones. Let's see. Stephen asked about the chances that the ECA will be reformed before the 24 election. And as you said, the time right now is really critical. So if you could give your thoughts on that, but also let me add one thing to that. It was reported, I believe, on the NewsHour yesterday that the minority leader has said that he's going to block any effort on the ECA and other possible bipartisan legislation if the Democrats move forward with any reconciliation bill, as they're working on with Senator Manchin now. Have you heard about that? And is that a real threat to any progress now? And if we don't get it done now, what are the chances in the next few years, as Stephen has asked?
So I will say, I'll take the last question first, which is, I think this year is the best year we have to reform the Electoral Count Act. Once presidential campaigns get underway, once we sort of see what the 118th Congress looks like in terms of the makeup of the House or Senate, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult. I would have real fear to our ability to get any bill, let alone a good bill, that hits the 5 things that we just walked through out of Congress to the president's desk. In terms of Leader McConnell's position, his past comments specifically on the Electoral Count Act have been very open to the reforms, have been very open to the working group process. And so he's been quietly supportive of the working group process moving forward, at least in his public statements. In terms of this latest contretemps, I really couldn't speak to that. I think that's, it sort of, we'll have to see how that unfolds under the next few weeks. At the moment, with Senator Leahy out of commission and Senator Schumer with COVID, I think it would be even difficult for them to muster 50 votes to pass a reconciliation bill. So I think it's going to be interesting and sort of unclear how the next few weeks of the July session will unfold. They've been working on a reconciliation bill since since last summer. So I think you can lose a lot of money betting on a reconciliation bill and its timing in DC. And just as a reminder, this is more nerdery than perhaps you want. Budget reconciliation is a process that generally is timed to a fiscal year that has passed. So this is all timed to a budget resolution that was supposed to have passed last February or March, and a reconciliation bill that had instructions that were due last September, October. And so that is when, under the normal letter of the process and the congressional budget rules, that was all supposed to happen. And so it's already quite extraordinary that we're talking about a fiscal year 22 reconciliation bill in July of that year.
A couple of people have asked about the basically the 5 points that Protect Democracy is asking for, the 5 main reforms that are needed. And I understand that these are listed on your website, and people can go to that. But specifically, there's a question about, I guess, the ones that aren't the low-hanging fruit. I guess this is numbers 3 through 5 that are a little more complicated. And that is, so what are the objections that have been raised to your arguments on those, and how might we deal with those objections if they come up at our meetings?
I think one of the concerns that we've heard on fixing section 2 is, how do you clarify without running the risk of adding new words that could be misunderstood later? And I get that concern. I think there's a lot of targeted ways to clean up the ambiguities, maybe even targeted deletions to clean up the ambiguities without hopefully introducing new ones. So that's one thing I will say. The other thing I will just point out is it's important to make sure that we clarify if there is an exception and what the parameters of it are. Article 2 gives Congress the power to set the time for an election. And the first section of the Electoral Count Act uses that. It says, okay, it's this day. And if you take away section 2, you take away the flexibility for states to deal with extraordinary circumstances that we all hope never happen, that have never actually been activated in law, but that exist in the background. So if there is an extraordinary national disaster and you can't vote for a period of days around election day, what happens then? Or if there is a terrorist attack and somebody destroys a bunch of ballots or voting machines, like what happens then? There are a lot of states that have laws on the books to deal with emergencies. There are some states that even have laws in the books to deal with emergencies specific to elections. But all of those state laws exist in the framework where Congress has provided some flexibility in section 2 for those laws to operate. And so whatever they do in section 2 needs to account for some reasonable flexibility that is cabined, enough to allow emergencies to be dealt with, but not so much that you invite constitutional misadventure.
Great, that's helpful. A number of folks have made a similar point, which is that reforming the Electoral Count Act is really important to make sure that we don't have some of the shenanigans that went on in 2020, January 6th. But it's part of a wider context of threats to our democracy. Some like threats to poll workers, and others like the fact that the whole electoral college system itself might have made sense in the 18th century, but these days it turns out that it really seems to disenfranchise a lot of people, or else gives a great advantage to certain small states. So the question that has been raised, by focusing so much on the Electoral Count Act, do we hamstring ourselves from dealing with some of those wider issues and dealing with some of the issues that we'd hoped to reform in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, which unfortunately didn't go through. Is there that danger?
I will say that Protect Democracy strongly supported the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We were, of course, disappointed to see, as where I would imagine you guys, that the act failed in the Senate. That said, it failed in the Senate, and we don't have the votes to move it forward. And the working group members have made it clear that they don't have the votes. That this process of engagement around the Electoral Count Act hasn't changed any of the votes of the people who've already taken positions on that bill several times. That is regrettable, but that is also where we are. And I think it's incredibly important for us to be practical about what the sort of aperture is, what the opportunity is that we have before us. We have a real opportunity to move forward on admittedly a different issue with a much narrower set of goals that would address a specific risk to presidential elections. It's not everything we want by any means, but it is an important thing to do. And it's an important window of opportunity to take up to do it. And the kinds of support that I think people are hoping to marshal for this bill, particularly in the Senate, are just wildly different than the kind of vote margins that folks were talking about for the other efforts. There are more than 10 Republicans who are sort of engaged, but at least 10 in the room when it comes to the Senate working group, this bipartisan group of senators who are engaged in Electoral Count Act reform. And reportedly in public reports, they're looking not to, cobble together 50 Democrats and 10 Republicans. They're looking to build a bill that can get broad support, not just from their own group, but from their colleagues. And that's going to have to, bring people together from very different places in the political spectrum, from very different places, even within the Senate Republican Conference itself. And to do that, you have to make some practical choices about what you can get into the bill. So I think we're certainly supportive of folks who are working to include, as you say, protections for poll workers, protections for perhaps clarifying, the ascertainment of presidential transition resources. I think we're hopeful that there are some what you sort of call pluses that could be included. But we also don't want to lose the forest for the trees. We want to make sure that people also see that the ECA is worth reforming for its own sake. And at the end of the day, it's important to push for that as well, to help move that forward and to find agreement in those places where we can. Painful as it is.
Yeah, great answer. Yeah. People have already mentioned the hearing today. Hardly help it be struck by what's coming up in these January 6 hearings. It was, I think, thought at one time that these hearings would add some energy to the push to reform the ECA, but it's kind of difficult to see evidence that it's doing that. But do you think the hearings have helped with this, or do you see that they are pushing this along?
I think the hearings have been extraordinary, particularly in helping people understand just what happened and the role that very dusty, obscure laws like the Electoral Count Act played in what happened on January 6th. I think absent, somebody laying out the story, it's difficult to explain to people like why people are meeting on January 6th, why Congress was involved, what even the context was for all of this happening. So I think that's incredibly important. I will say that I think it's also important to note that to achieve the kind of broad agreement across Democratic and Republican members that we think we need to for an Electoral Count Act reform bill to move forward, I think different people will engage with this in different ways. There will absolutely be members who come to the table saying, I want to prevent another January 6th. And that is an absolutely appropriate and true thing that you can do through Electoral Count Act reform. There will also be people, including people who represent folks in this call, who are coming to the table from a very different perspective, who are coming to the table saying, I don't think a vice president should be allowed to pick the next president of the United States. And I want to make sure that Vice President Harris doesn't have the very undemocratic power of doing so. And that's just, I think, a reflection of, frankly, that we live in a democracy that has elected members of Congress who come from different places geographically, politically, rhetorically, in a bunch of different ways. And they're going to engage with it in those different ways.
Yeah, great. One more question on sort of the chances and what's going on here. I think there was a news report back around June 8th. Senator Collins was quoted as saying, we've been reaching agreement. We've got most of it worked out. And I think there's just one more issue we've got to resolve, and hopefully we can get it out within a week or so. And gosh, more than a month has gone by and haven't heard anything. Do you know what's going on? What the holdup is?
Our understanding is as far as we know, and we've been pretty engaged with partners as well as partners on and off the Hill, is that the working group is still working very hard to reach agreement. And we're very hopeful that they could do so soon. We're preparing as best we can to help support it, we hope, depending upon what the agreement is. And we're still hopeful to see something shortly. Now, would I bet my firstborn on it? No. Too precious to me. But certainly we are working very hard on it. This is still one of our, top priorities that, we have a team that wakes up every morning thinking, what can I humanly possibly do today to help the Electoral Conduct Reform Bill move forward? And we think there is a serious chance of seeing a proposal and hopefully moving it forward.
Great. Pablo or Fred or Donna, have I missed any questions? I'm not used to doing this role, so I may well have missed something. So.
No, I think you did wonderfully. Thank you. And I guess I'll just ask Cerin one question, which is, what you said at the top of the call, at the top of your presentation, that the faith-based actors are important in this conversation. Do you have any guidance about which offices really need to hear an avalanche of principled concern from faith-based actors like the USJ?
Honestly, I think this is one of those situations where advocating for change is a team sport. Bring your whole team. Like, you all have 2 senators. You're blessed with those because I come from Washington, D.C. I don't have them. So appreciate what you have and please talk to them. Members of the House are not as engaged at the moment with the details because it really is still in the hands of the House Administration Committee. We hope that if there's a proposal shortly from the Senate Working Group, that there may be an opportunity soon in the coming weeks for broader groups of senators to engage. And I think it's really important for them, for their staff, for the members, if you can get to the senators, to hear from you that this is important to you, that you want to see them engaged. So for you folks from North Carolina, Senator Tillis is on the working group. He's engaged. He's sending his staff to these meetings. He's going to these meetings. Senator Burr, not yet. But that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to go, to example, to Senator Burr's staff and say, hey, Senator Tillis is engaged in this. That's great. He's not even on committee. He's still engaged. We really want you to do that too. We want you to be ready to hit the ground running when this comes out. And going to senators, so folks from Connecticut, Senator Murphy, also in the working group, Senator Blumenthal, not yet engaged. Great opportunity to go to Senator Blumenthal and say, hey, we would love to see you taking action on this. We would love to see you engaging in this. We think it's important to move this bill forward. We think it's important to our democracy to actually reform this and fix these problems this year, not in the future. And him hearing that message from you is incredibly important. I mean, those aren't like the only 2 senators you should call, but like pick the ones that are yours. I used to work in a Senate office for a long time. And the thing that speaks loudest to them is constituents. People in their state who they are there to represent the voices of, calling, going in person, going in Zooms, going by mail to say that they care.
Well, thank you. That is what UUSJ tries to organize. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Reverend Lisa to extinguish the chalice. But I will just say one last time, if you haven't written a letter with UUSJ to your senator on this matter, follow the link that's in the chat and please write them a letter. And let's make sure that there's an avalanche of principled concern on this matter. Reverend Lisa.
Thanks, Pablo. Amen. Hey, Cerin, I just drove 8 hours and I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to hang. You just dropped so much beautiful knowledge on us. I'm so pumped. I'm ready to go. I think a lot of folks here on the call, I don't know if folks can come off the call quick, if it's okay for me to ask you to do that. Like, just give Cerin so much love. We are so grateful you are such an important, vital contributor to this movement. Thank you for all of that. The details are sacred, y'all, right? Like, these details are sacred. You're talking about, Cerin, you're talking about like the nerd, like nerding out and like the nerdery, like, can I get an amen to the sacred nerdery, right? Just like how sacred nerding out can be. Right? Because what you've taught us today and what you've talked to us about today is that we have the power to change this. When we believe in the sacred possibility of the details and of changing this. So I'm ready to go. I bet our folks could get some love in the chat, like North Carolina, you ready to go? You ready to start calling Tillis? You ready to folks on these calls, you ready to get into those legislative visits with you, USJ, that they so beautifully coordinate for us. This is a team sport. We need everybody. We've got a lot of lawyers in the House. We got a lot of people who are constituents who can make those calls. Sometimes the tipping point is like when people believe in the tipping point, right? And as people of faith, we are called to believe in the possibility of this moment and to believe that if each of us contributes a drop in the bucket, even if we can't see that bucket, we have the faith to know that that bucket is on the verge of overflowing. Let that be our faith. Let us have faith in us and in this movement and this wider network with folks like Cerin, with our broader partners. Let's have faith in us that we can get this over the finish line and really celebrate our power to do that. That is our faith. That is our faith. So amen to the nerdery of tonight. And with that, I will extinguish our chalice in gratitude for being together tonight, for the lessons we have learned, the education. And the last thing I'll say is the power of this briefing, the power of this evening lies in what we do next, right? So may the power of this night extend and ripple out, get on the phone. Let's be a part of a movement that gets the ECA over the finish line. And gratitude again to all of you for being a part of this faith and a part of this movement. Pablo, anything else from you or from our incredible crew of David or Donna? Anybody else? Before we close?
I'll just add, I see a couple of people in the chat from states where we're actually meeting with your senators. So West Virginia, Connecticut, Illinois. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you should email me because we have meetings scheduled. And once we get through the scheduled meetings, then we should figure out how to follow up on Cerin's suggestion and meet with the other senator from your state. So make sure that you connect with me and get the RSVP information for those set meetings. And for anybody else, keep an eye on our emails. We regularly invite folks to join us when we have these opportunities. And we try to target you and get you to join us, but we got to see our emails in order to find out about the opportunities. Thank you so much, folks.
Thank you, Cerin.
So,
Good night, everyone.
good night. Thank you, Cerin. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna linger a minute or two here. Thank you, Reverend Lisa. Please go rest after your long.
Go take a nap. I'm gonna go to bed. Bye, everyone. North Carolina, see you on Friday. Let's make those calls. Let's get going. Thank you,
For
Donna.
anyone else who has like a lingering question, in particular about the program, now is a good time to ask.
Pablo, Suzanne Zilber asked if people are going to be trained on what to talk about tomorrow. So if
Yeah.
you want to address that.
Yes. So first off, let's end recording.